Hello, respective viewers. It's George from Ireland. So I'm reflecting on the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, and here we are coming up to the second anniversary. That's only like 5 weeks away, and it's patent that Russia is gaining the upper hand and could make a decisive breakthrough this year. I don't think it's going to happen. I say give it a 40% chance. What do you mean by decisive breakthrough? As in take up to 50% of Ukraine, which might include Kiev. I don't think the war is going to end. I think it's going to go on till at least 2025, but we shall see. But Russia's been adopted an attritional strategy after the first phase failed by the summer of 2022. So it's increasingly gaining the upper hand in a number of ways. First of all, numbers is partly that. Is things as simple as that. People say, oh, it's maneuver and elan and military genius, and sometimes that's the case. And I always have to underscore that I'm not a military man at all. Simply a student of history and political analyst. So they've always had a much higher population than Ukraine, another one almost 4-1, bearing in mind that Ukraine has lost something like 20% of its population. Those who've gone abroad, a few of them to Russia, though. Some of them voluntarily, most of them voluntarily, a few of them kidnapped, particularly children. Russia can replace losses more than Ukrainians if they're 1-for-1. They're more like 2-for-1. The Battle of Bakhmut, they're probably 5-for-1 last year. The Russians are conscripting more people, and of course they can pressurize or indeed recruit guest laborers from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and other poverty-stricken erstwhile Soviet republics. And the Ukrainians are having trouble because the Verkhovna Rada, that parliament, it's not passing this conscription bill that would cast the net wider. And so many of the guys who've been served for 2 years as conscript or as volunteers haven't had a break. And they're going to say, well, I've done my duty to my country. What about my duty to my wife and children, stuff like that? And they're just mentally and physically through it. They're beyond fatigue. They're at the point of collapse. And the government is very reluctant to grant them leave in case it's suddenly needed. Or if you grant them leave, some of them will just desert. They'll go into hiding. So younger guys are not being conscripted in sufficient numbers. There are too many exemptions. The Ukrainians abroad who didn't come back for the war, and countries like Estonia and Germany said they will not arrest Ukrainian men who refuse to answer a summons for compulsory military service in Ukraine. But these NATO and European countries need to decide, do they want Ukraine to win or not? Because if they do, they've got to take the necessary measures. I mean, the refusing to arrest Ukrainians who dodged the draft, is that something we're willing to have them lose over? Is that moral principle more important than Ukraine's survival, and therefore the survival of NATO and the European Union? Because we've got to consider the cascade of consequences were Russia to triumph from Ukraine, and they'll be grave indeed. And by triumph, I don't mean remain in occupation of, say, up to 20% of Ukraine, like a real triumph, as in take the whole country or most of it, have a puppet regime, something like that. I suggest that would have dire repercussions for European security, and for countries like Moldova and Georgia would probably be completely absorbed into Putin's evil empire. So there's numbers, there's munitions, Western countries just not supplying sufficient munitions. And I know Ukraine's got its own armaments industry, but obviously that they can't provide enough as they need. So the Russians have got a major advantage in that one, even though they're often lower grade munitions the Russians are manufacturing, and things like drones. Now, the Ukrainians are boasting of their increasingly long range and sophisticated drones, one of which struck St. Petersburg, struck an oil facility a few days ago. Now, the Russian authorities neither confirmed or denied. Seems like affirmative silence to me. We know that Ukrainians go for oil facilities. They hit one in Bryansk just a couple of days ago. So St. Petersburg is also a psychological blow. It's Putin's hometown, and the Ukrainians have never been able to hit something so far away before. So their range is going to increase and increase. On the other hand, does this do any real damage? Wouldn't they better off concentrating their fire on strictly military objectives? Russian military units in illegally occupied Ukraine or just over the border, staging posts for the occupation forces. Munitions. The Ukrainians are losing there. They're running desperately short of munitions, and NATO countries are just not supplying enough. And I realize not all NATO countries are doing it. Turkey's not, for instance. The Ukrainians might be reduced to throwing stones. Okay, I speak only behalf in jest. The other factor is economic. The funding package from the European Union, from the United States is not coming through. Now, European Union countries can donate severally. Non-EU countries such as the United Kingdom has donated, Switzerland likewise, but the liberality is not enough. And countries that have been very generous, like Norway, and say, well, we've done our bit, it behoves others to do their bit. And then the war weariness is setting in Western countries, saying, well, we're so fatigued, are we even helping them? Easily 50,000 Ukrainian soldiers been killed, easily 10,000 Ukrainian civilians. And are we simply prolonging the agony by leveling the playing field? If Russia wins, then it's over. Well, we all know it's not over. The war will only just begin, because Ukraine will not be the last victim. And so people are just switching off, just got bored of it, and they just no longer feel so sorry for the Ukrainians, and getting fed up of Ukrainian civilians as refugees. So now Russia's economy is paying a price. Not that high a price. The sanctions are only semi-effective, very leaky. And the Ukrainians are saying, well, can you please stop all these electronic components getting through to Russia? They're often sold for civilian purposes. They're dual use. They're retooled for military purposes. You often sell them to third countries like the UAE, Turkey, Kazakhstan, wherever. And despite the end user certificate, they're sold on. These not for resale clauses and contracts are just broken. You need to stop selling them to countries which have a habit of reselling them to the Russian Federation. So there's that. So there's troops, munitions, and funding. The Ukrainians might not be able to pay their soldiers or to civil servants, whoever, intelligence officers, to maintain vital infrastructure for electricity, heating, for the roads and railways and so on, because they're not getting the 6 billion euros a month they need from the European Union simply to sustain these operations. And then there's obviously a psychological factor. The Ukrainians feeling that their allies are letting them down, that they're a forlorn hope, they're abandoned. They better make an accommodation with Putin before it gets even worse. Now, what was fascinating last week is how Belarus unveiled a new military doctrine and about how it would go to war if it were aggressed by another country, or indeed its vital interests were threatened. It made me think, is this a staging post to Ukraine actually being invaded by Belarus? Because, of course, Russian troops have been in Belarus since Belarusian independence, 1991. It's a part of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO. One of the reasons that Lukashenko hung on when the mass democracy protests in 2020 is he had Putin's fulsome support. So Putin might say, it's payback time, we really need you. Now, Belarus has only got like 9 million people, Russia's 140 million. It does have troops. Some of those could be used. They say it's quite poorly equipped. They haven't fought since Afghanistan in the 80s, when they're a Soviet republic, that there might be a mutiny. I'm not sure there would be, actually. And that'd be another front for Ukraine to have to defend. And it's very lightly guarded at the moment. They have tried to build some defenses over there, but it's rather patchy. So that could lead to the collapse of Ukraine. So I think, why were they doing that? So yeah, it's a bit worrying. Obviously, Russian nuclear weapons are stationed there. So the totality of that is actually looking quite grim for Ukraine. And it's the time that people woke up to that. Imagine a scenario where the Russian flag is planted over the Ukrainian parliament, where Russia takes most or indeed all of Ukraine, and millions more refugees pour into the European Union. And it would be really a green light for China to retake Taiwan. And I know China's got an arguable case for that. It'd be very bad news. It would gravely undermine NATO. Countries wouldn't want to join it, or some of them might even leave it. What's happening in Slovakia and Hungary, where the prime minister is actually fairly sympathetic to Putin, is obviously very dispiriting for Ukraine or anyone who loves freedom. So that's why Russia's gradually gaining the upper hand. And its economy is not suffering enough to make them change course. They also believe time is on their side, that Trump's going to come back, and there's a serious chance, like 40% chance, that'll happen. He would at the very least reduce aid to Ukraine, if not cut it off altogether. He might not have a Republican Congress, which would somewhat constrain what he can do were he to come back. Anyway, so we really need to save Ukraine. And in doing so, it would actually save Russia too at the long term from Putinism. But thank you so much for watching my channel. Make sure you subscribe on Patreon and donate on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Toodaloo.